Division I World Series evening. Thanks for coming out. I'm Alan Levine. Together with Tom Merrill, we run the Political Theory Institute. You can follow us on Twitter at PTI @AU, but not the @ sign, the letters AT, PTI @AU. We have two other events this semester. The next one is on November 13th when we have Danielle Allen of Harvard University, a major public intellectual, talking about the Declaration of Independence today. And on December 3rd, we have Henry Higuera talking about Cervantes' Don Quixote. Our topic for this evening is immigration. This event is part of a series of conversations co-hosted by the Political Theory Institute with the Institute for Humane Studies and sponsored by the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, and we're grateful for their support. The format for the evening is first I'll say a few words on the history of immigration in the U.S. and introduce our guests. Then each speaker will speak for 20 or 25 minutes and then talk to each other, maybe moderated by me, and then we'll take Q&A from the floor, and we'll have either a microphone set up in the middle aisle, or we'll have one to pass. Every American knows these words. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. But in reality, not everyone has favored immigration. Some have always seen America as a land of liberty and opportunity and as a revolutionary beacon that would change not just our country, but the world. At the time of the American Revolution, European philosophers praised the new nation for, among other things, being an asylum for the oppressed. The philosopher Dennis Diderot wrote, quote, "Let the idea of such an asylum alarm the despots and serve as a restraint to them." Meaning, if governments mistreated their own people because they didn't care about them, now, with a land to which their subjects could emigrate, perhaps they would treat them better, if not for the right reasons, at least for selfish reasons, so they could still have people to tyrannize. At home, Americans have long been ambivalent about immigration. Put simply, there have been three main periods of immigration policy in America. The first period goes from the first British settlers in the early 1600s to, typically picked as the date, 1924. During this period, there are some state restrictions from the individual states on immigration, but few federal. For the most part, you showed up, you underwent a health check, and you were admitted legally. Until the 1850s, most people who came were Protestants from Northern and Western Europe. The 1850s saw the beginning of several waves of Catholics and Jews fleeing poverty and pogroms to this country. And this gave rise to reactions. The Know-Nothings in the 1850s were anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. If you don't know the Know-Nothings, Google them. And it led to much worry for at least 75 years, and arguably until today, that the Italians, Irish, Slavs, and Jews, and then the other groups coming in the future, would not be assimilable. This gave rise to the second main period of immigration, a period of restrictions, after World War I until 1965. Major restrictions were done by country. Priorities given to northern immigrants from Northern and Western European nations. Drastic limitations on Southern Europeans, on Jews and Slavs, the exclusion of Chinese. And so in short, it enshrined into law the pattern of immigration by habit pre-1850. The third period is the period of the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965 until today. removed limits based on race and geography, leading to America looking more like the world. It increased the number of immigrants. Preferences were given to family members. At the same time, as immigration was radically increasing during this period legally, influx of Mexicans, estimated about half legal and half illegal, got most of the attention concerning immigration. This led to new restrictions. A series of Reagan-era laws that legalized the then undocumented people on the condition of future border enforcement and future employment verification. The future things never really coming to be. This led eventually to a regime of laws, law enforcement, and infrastructure to control the later undocumented arrivals. In today's situation, in 2017 numbers, it's estimated that we have about 14% of Americans are foreign-born. 14% are foreign-born. And that rivals the peak periods of immigration in the 1880s and the early 1900s. Anecdotally, it seems to me, we love diversity in food and entertainment and cheap gardening. But we also worry about whether so many immigrants from so many different countries with so many different backgrounds and mores can cohere. Whether the social mores will hold. And now we have a president who talks about immigration all the time, stoking fear, and so what to do? Who to admit, how many? We have two excellent people to help us think through this issue today. We have Ramesh Ponnuru, who is a senior editor at the National Review, where he's covered national politics and policy for more than 20 years. He's also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion, which syndicates his articles in newspapers across the nation. He's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. He serves as a contributing editor to National Affairs, the quarterly journal of conservative ideas. He's a contributor to Face the Nation on CBS. And in 2015, he was included in the Politico 50, Politico's list of, quote, the thinkers, doers, and dreamers who really matter in American politics. That's some list to be on.
They didn't tell me which one I was.
Ponnuru grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, and graduated from Princeton University, where he's a student of one of PTI's great friends, Robert P. George. He will be our second speaker. Our first speaker tonight will be Shikha Damia, and she's a senior analyst at the Reason Foundation. She's a columnist at The Week, writes regularly for Reason magazine, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Times of London, Time magazine, USA Today, and the Daily Beast. She previously served as a columnist for Forbes and the Washington Examiner. Damia's feature on sanctuary churches won the first prize in immigration reporting at the 2019 Southern California Journalism Awards. She's a co-winner of the 2009 Bastiat Prize for online journalism for her columns in Forbes and Reason. From 1996 to 2004, Damia was an award-winning editorial writer at the Detroit News. She also has worked as a reporter for The Patriot, a national daily newspaper based in New Delhi, India, where she grew up. She frequently appears on Fox Business Network, BBC News Business Matters, MSNBC, and other television and radio outlets. She earned her master's degree in mass communications from Louisiana State University and holds a postgraduate diploma in journalism from the Indian Institute of Mass Communications. So you'll see they're both eminently qualified. Neither of them has a PhD, and so we're holding down the egghead factor tonight. So please join me in welcoming Shikha Damia.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks to Tom Merrill as well. And thanks to Ramesh for being here too. this president has generated so much heat on immigration that the IPCC has been saying global warming is going to arrive a little earlier than predicted. Ramesh is a very chill guy, so I'm hoping he and I can get through this evening without melting the polar ice caps, but we'll see. Actually, Alan has made my job very easy. He's given an excellent introduction to the history of immigration, so I can actually pack up and leave, really. He summarized it really well. But the question for this evening is, what should U.S. immigration policy be? As Alan said, in a country that understands itself as the land of immigrants and where the Statue of Liberty stands tall at its gate, one would think that the answer is actually not so difficult, a policy of a wide and warm embrace of immigrants. In fact, it would seem odd that this is even an open question. But the interesting thing is that every century there is just one president who Can you hear me?
Could you hear before?
No.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because jokes are not funny if they are repeated.
Yes, they are.
Well, my husband thinks so. He repeats them.
His jokes are yours.
But to go back, so in a country where the Statue of Liberty stands at the gate, one would think that the question of what kind of immigration policy we ought to have should be easy to answer. Wide, warm policy towards immigrants. But the interesting thing is that in every century there is one president, literally, who gets the answer right. And in our century, it's not Donald Trump, spoiler alert. In the 19th century, the president who stands out on this issue is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a big proponent of maintaining America's open border immigration policy of the time, an opponent of the know-nothing nativist movement that Alan referred to. Even before he became president in 1855, he wrote a letter in which he said, "As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will be all men are created equal except for Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." After he became president, and on July 4th, 1864, that's Independence Day, Lincoln signed into law a bill called an Act to Encourage Immigration. How quaint that sounds in Trump's America, where deportation squads, even as we speak, are doubling down, rounding up peaceful and productive immigrants with long roots in the country in the name of interior enforcement. Or where Trump demanded a 40% cut in legal immigration as a condition for letting dreamers stay here. It is striking that a country that committed the original sin of slavery to forcibly bring foreign labor into America should now be going to such draconian lengths to throw voluntary foreign labor out of the country. In the 20th century, the president who came closest to getting the answer right was Ronald Reagan. Trump thinks he invented the Make America Great Again slogan, the stable genius. In fact, Reagan beat him to it. He ran on a Let's Make America Great Again campaign, except that he used the phrase to argue not for pulling up the drawbridge to promote an ethno-nationalist state, as Trump is doing, but the opposite. He said we should throw open America's Golden Gate because the immigrant, in his view, brought with them courage and the values of family, work, and freedom. In other words, without immigrants, America wouldn't have any Golden Gates to slam. So which brings me to the main thread of this discussion, which will be an economic case for immigration. So why should America want immigrants? There is an overwhelming consensus among economists that immigration is a great blessing, a win-win for both immigrants and the host country. Literally every economist of every persuasion, Adam Smith, Keynes, Ludwig von Mises, believed that allowing labor to move where it was most productive would produce benefits for everyone. Curiously, there was one prominent exception historically, and his name was Karl Marx. He regarded England's decision to absorb the surplus Irishmen being driven out of their country during the Great Famine not as a benefit, but a ploy by the English bourgeoisie to force down the wages and lower the material and moral position of the English working class. Those were his words. The popular modern-day restrictionist canard that immigration from the third world to rich countries is tantamount to importing poverty has its genesis in Marx's thought. So it's interesting we find conservatives today channeling Marx. The primary reason that people find this kind of thinking appealing is that the case for immigration is indeed very counterintuitive. It is hard to see how in a world of finite resources, allowing more people into a country would enhance its prosperity instead of leading to overcrowding and congestion and unemployment. President Trump perfectly encapsulated this mentality recently when he declared that our country is full. But if our country is full, should we also restrict childbirth like China did at the height of the population explosion fear? This is a Malthusian worldview that has been thoroughly defeated several times. At the heart of this issue of immigration is also an issue that bedevils the environmentalist movement. Are humans a liability who deplete resources, or an asset who themselves are a resource? Indeed, to use the parlance of the late great environmental economist Julian Simon, the ultimate resource. It is the ingenuity of human beings that turns fallow land bounteous, dirt into valuable metals, and sand into computer chips. There is no given or fixed set of natural resources out there, Simon pointed out. Useless materials become resources once human creativity finds a way to harness them. Oil was just a toxic black liquid in the ground till humans discovered that it could be burned for light and power. The development of high-yield grains increased the productivity of land exponentially, while human population grew only arithmetically, the exact opposite of what Malthus had predicted. So the most important factor limiting a country's economic progress then isn't insufficient physical resources, but insufficient human resources. Hence, contrary to Malthusian or Trumpian thinking, population increases through immigration are nothing to fret over when you have institutions able to harness the human talent. Immigrants are not only mouths that need to be fed, but they are also minds and hands that grow the economic pie. They certainly consume resources, but they produce far more than they consume over the long run when given an opportunity. To the extent that immigrants, whether high-skilled or low-skilled, have jobs, it's because they produce more in wealth or value for their employers than they consume in wages, or they wouldn't have jobs. Imagine for a moment that there were foreign planes periodically airdropping free goods on American homes. Wouldn't it be colossally stupid to send missiles to shoot them down? Yet why is it not equally foolish to shoo away the real source of this wealth, namely Mexicans, whose sweat makes affordable housing possible for Americans and puts cheap goods into those houses, or when it turns away Chinese computer engineers whose smarts virtually spin gold from sand? In the modern world, we seem to think that migration is something we've invented through plane travel and fast communication. Actually, large movements of people, even between settled civilizations, not just nomadic cultures, have always been part and parcel of human history. What's relatively new are the political barriers to mobility, and these have become tenacious. About 3% of the world's population lived outside its birth country in 1900, and 3% does so now. Not a deluge, not a tsunami, but a trickle, despite the canard of mass immigration that nativists and restrictionists have weaponized to launch their anti-immigration populist backlash around the world. Refugee flows are distinguished from economic migrants and are dominating our political consciousness right now. But these are episodic and brief because they are the result of turmoil. The vast majority of migration is economic in nature and driven by the differential levels of productivity between developed and developing countries. The lower productivity of the latter means, for example, that Mexicans can earn twice more, Indians over 5 times more, Haitians 10 times more, and Nigerians 15 times more for the same work in the United States. Trapping immigrants in low productivity countries results in huge losses, not just for them, but for global productivity. How huge? Center for Global Development's Michael Clemens has estimated that if anyone could take a job anywhere they wanted, our $75 trillion global world product would experience an instant boost of 50 to 150% annually. Using the lower number, that would mean adding 37 trillion of wealth to the world. Even if you discount Clemens by 50%, we are still talking $17 trillion of the size of the US economy added to the world every year, which would end global poverty while enriching first world residents. Even the meager immigration that the US has allowed since 1965 has made this country immensely richer. Reasonable estimates suggest that the total annual contribution of foreign-born workers to the US economy adds up to roughly $2 trillion, or about 10% of annual GDP. Optimist numbers put that figure higher. But even an immigration pessimist like Harvard University's George Borhaus puts it at $1.6 trillion. Not too many people outside hardcore nativist circles believe that high-skilled foreigners are anything but an unmitigated economic blessing. Even Ramesh and his colleague Rehan Salam, who recently wrote an excellent book, accept that. According to one estimate, 50% of productivity growth in the United States between 1950 to 1993 could be attributed to the growth in the number of foreign scientists and engineers in this country. Between 2000 and 2017, immigrants won nearly 40% of the American Nobel Prizes. An Indian American economist won the Nobel just last week. Highly educated immigrants obtained patents at double the rate of highly educated natives. Immigrants and their children were responsible for founding 46% of all the Fortune 500 companies in America in 2017. A quarter of all startups were founded by immigrants. 55% of $1 billion worth startups had immigrant founders. Apple was founded by the son of Syrian refugees. It is hardly an exaggeration to suggest that if America's economy has become the innovative hub of the world, dominating virtually every industry in the 21st century, from IT to media to entertainment, it is at least partly because of immigration. But does all this success by high-skilled immigrants steal jobs and wealth from native-born Americans? No. The rise in GDP due to immigration has boosted native wages. What about employment? Do high-skilled workers take away native jobs? No again. One additional young high-skilled immigrant worker creates 3.1 jobs for US-born workers. And because foreign high-skilled workers also earn a high income, they pay far more in taxes than they consume in welfare. The real immigration controversy is over low-skilled immigrants. The fear with respect to them is that they don't create jobs for natives, they compete with them and lower their wages, and they drain social services. But there is very little support for these fears in the economics literature. There are 3 reasons that low-skilled foreigners don't, on the whole, depress native wages. They actually raise them. 1, the vast majority of Americans are not competitors of low-skilled immigrants, but their customers. And the real wages of these customers are increased because the price of goods and services go down due to cheap foreign labor, allowing these Americans to buy more for the same income. This is tantamount to getting a raise while just sitting at home. Also, these low-skilled workers boost the productivity of high-skilled natives by freeing them from tasks that generate higher returns, both monetary and psychic. Lawyers can spend more time on billable hours rather than ironing shirts if they can take them to their Korean dry cleaner, or spend more time on bedtime reading for their kids if they can get Chinese takeout. In fact, even Ray Han, in his book, Panning Low-Skilled Immigration, admits that these immigrants have allowed him to enjoy the lifestyle of a Rockefeller in New York by putting affordable dog walking, housekeeping, nannying, cleaning, cooking, and transportation services at his beck and call. The second reason why low-skilled immigrants actually don't mean fewer jobs for native-borns is that restrictionists claim that jobs are a zero-sum game is not true. To the extent that the foreign-born offer cheaper labor, they allow more businesses to form. And more businesses means more jobs for Americans. Restrictionists often argue that with less immigration, the labor market would tighten, compelling American businesses to pay native workers more. That may happen in some cases, but what will also happen is that businesses will be compelled to charge higher prices, thus shrinking demand. Some businesses will go broke or shrink or never get off the ground in the first place, thus diminishing jobs for natives. The third reason why low-skilled foreign-born workers don't actually diminish job opportunities for Americans is that immigrant workers are complements of native workers, not their substitutes, at both the high-skilled and the low-skilled level. If you look at the distribution of immigrants in the economy, it resembles an hourglass, with foreigners occupying the higher rung of jobs in STEM fields where Americans are not available, or lower rung jobs where Americans are not willing. Americans are concentrated in the mid-skilled service jobs. The market does a very good job of directing immigrants where they are needed. In some, economists who have examined this issue, even Borjas, have found a positive impact on the wages of every cohort of natives, whether high school grads or college grads. The only negative impact that anyone has reported is Borjas on the wages of native high school dropouts, a vanishing subset of the population. But other economists actually have failed to corroborate that effect. So even if you accept Borjas' negative assessment, well over 90% of American workers experience wage gains, not losses due to low-skilled immigration. The economic arguments against shutting America's door to low-skilled immigrants are exceedingly weak. But what about the fiscal argument, that they strain the welfare state because they consume more in social services than they pay in taxes? Even this argument is weak. For starters, contrary to the right-wing stereotype of Hispanics being welfare queens, the fact is that employment rate is extremely high among even undocumented Hispanics, at least 7-8 percentage points higher than that of natives in the same socioeconomic strata. But their welfare consumption, both the rate of the welfare consumption and the actual value of the welfare consumption, is also lower than that of native-born in the same strata. This is true even when they have American-born children who are eligible for all the welfare benefits. But the big point is that if you look at the social spending in this country, only a small portion of it goes towards means-tested benefits for the poor, about $800 billion. About twice that amount, or $1.5 trillion, is spent on the old in the form of Social Security and Medicare. And over $1 trillion is spent on school and the college of the young. But the vast majority of low-skilled immigrants come to this country in their 20s, just after another society has borne the great cost of educating them and before they become entitled to old age benefits. This means that we get the benefit from their most productive years just when they start earning an income and paying taxes. So in effect, we get a generational windfall. We would have to spend much, much more if we relied entirely on childbirth by natives to maintain our population levels and labor force. Given these huge economic upsides of immigration to the immigrants, America, and the world, what should U.S. immigration policy be? In an ideal world, America would implement the 21st century equivalent of the Ellis Island days prior to 1924, when Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act and made restrictionism America's default policy rather than open borders, what Alan referred to. That act limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through a national origins quota system that was designed to keep Asians and Eastern Europeans out. Prior to that, foreigners, with some notable exceptions like the Chinese, could more or less show up at America's ports where they were instantly handed papers if they were able-bodied and not, in the terms of that time, idiots, lunatics, convicts, or suffering from some contagious disease. And right next to the immigration booth when they walked off the ship were companies waiting to hand them their employment papers and put them to work. The beauty of that system was that our immigration policy wasn't in the hands of bureaucrats in the swamp trying to centrally plan the labor market for the entire country. Rather, employers and the country's residents were calling the shots. Their needs decided how many and what kind of immigrants came to America, not the arbitrary whims of bureaucrats. The government played a legitimate role in keeping out foreigners who posed a genuine security or a public health threat. But beyond that, it did not come between willing employers and willing workers. It didn't matter whether the immigrants were coming to work in farms, factories, or hospitals. That is a far cry from how our system currently works. The best way to describe our system is that it effectively imposes a blanket ban on immigration, which it then arbitrarily relaxes based on predefined bureaucratic categories or some political whim of the moment, whether it is encouraging family reunification or enhancing ethnic diversity or helping some industry that central planners deem is important. For 30 years, until Trump came along, these planners had been looking relatively benevolently towards foreign techies and made 85,000 H-1B guest worker visas available to them annually. The demand is twice or 3 times as much. Trump is in the process of gutting even this meager program. But one positive thing about H-1B visas is that they are what they call dual intent visas that allow their holders not only to work here, but to apply for permanent residency or green cards. The H-1B equivalents for agricultural and seasonal low-skilled workers don't allow that. They expire and the immigrants are required to go home. They're also tangled up in all kinds of red tape that make them not very usable. This is the chief source of our problem with undocumented workers. Restrictionists say people should obey the rule of law and wait in line for their turn, but there is no line for them, and the rule of law is a sham. A 21st century equivalent of Ellis Island is a political impossibility in my lifetime. The next best thing would be to try and get our immigration bureaucracy to approximate that model. Get rid of the high-skilled and low-skilled category, or at least raise the quotas in these categories and deregulate them to make them more usable. Make all of them dual intent, not just H-1Bs, so that everyone has an option of staying. To placate concerns of native workers, perhaps charge a hefty fee to issue these visas. Some Central American migrants are paying $10,000 to $20,000 to coyotes to sneak them into the country illegally. Some of that could be captured through fees to offset any fiscal impact or create a compensation fund for the natives that Borjas thinks are affected. But the single best thing that we could do would be to let states write their own immigration programs and hand out visas based on the needs of their own industry and economy. In effect, create their own guest worker programs. Uncle Sam can continue to control the grant of citizenship. Canada is already doing something like this through its provincial nominee program. This is the real Canadian model we ought to follow, not Ontario's industrial policy point system that I think Ramesh favors. If we stay on our current course, not only will we hurt immigrants, but we will cripple our economy, and as this president is showing, erode our humanity.
There we go. All right. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank the sponsors for making this possible and letting me lift my gaze from my latest deadline and the most recent presidential tweet to bigger topics. Before the microphone problem was fixed, Sheikha said that I'm a very chill guy. which I am going to quote the next time I write a book. It's going to be, I may even quote to my kids later today. But she also very craftily stacked the deck against me by associating my position with, in serial order, Donald Trump, Karl Marx, Thomas Malthus, and the lowest blow of all, the Canadian government.
I thought you were going to say Reagan.
Reagan's fine. So I'll try to live up to my chill billing by not taking too much exception to that. Actually, I should preface my remarks on immigration by saying that my views on immigration have changed over time on matters large and small, and they might change again, possibly as a result of this very debate. It is also true that our positions are not the starkest possible division that you can find on this set of issues in American politics today. This may be a disappointment. If anybody in the audience was hoping for something a little bit more diametrically opposed, but in fact, I'm not a fan of a lot of President Trump's approach to the immigration issue. I think that the family separation policy was monstrous, actually. I do not, while I think that increased physical barriers in parts of the border may make sense, I don't think that a big, beautiful wall does. I think that the president's frequent association of immigration and crime, violent crime, is false, demagogic, and dehumanizing. I'm not in favor of getting rid of birthright citizenship, something that the president has sometimes mused about doing by executive order. And I'm not, in principle, opposed to an amnesty for a lot of illegal immigrants who are in our country, and I would be perfectly willing to even call it an amnesty, as we did it. So, with the possibility that I've disappointed a few of you on those issues, but I did want to sort of clarify a little bit where I'm coming from. Let me talk a little bit about some of the underlying considerations or principles that I think ought to govern our thinking about immigration policy. First is that I think that setting the right immigration policy is a matter of balancing competing legitimate interests. And I think that a lot of the people involved and most vocal in the immigration debate have erred by trying to read some of those interests out of the picture. So, for example, I think that it is entirely understandable that people living in other countries would want to participate in the American labor market, which is one of the world's great blessings. I think it is entirely understandable that employers want as many available workers as they can at the lowest wage that they can pay and with the fewest benefits. I mean that genuinely. You do sometimes hear conservatives or others on the restrictionist side who sort of demonize such employers as, they're sort of blood-sucking exploiters and so forth. It just seems to me this is what the rational interests of employers lead them to want to do, and it has a lot of byproducts, some of them positive, some of them negative. The American public has, I think, a legitimate interest in the rule of law, in seeing that the policies that it has adopted are not simply going to be flouted and ignored. And then I think that the country as a whole has a legitimate interest in social cohesion. That one, I think, can become a touchy issue because it can often shade into racial and ethnic exclusion of a sort that I think is wrong and do not support, but I do think is analytically separable from the idea that the country needs to have a sense of itself and the sense of the people here as all belonging to the same country, the same society. And I'll have a little bit more to say about that in a bit. Secondly, I don't think that the economic arguments for or against immigration are especially decisive. And this is particularly with respect to the sort of macroeconomic questions of immigration's effect on the overall size of our economy, or the level of wages, or the level of employment. I accept a lot of my reading of the literature on this is, I think, in a lot of ways pretty similar to Shika's. I accept that immigration tends to increase GDP, but I also think that quite reasonably and understandably and rightly, most of that increase accrues to the immigrants themselves. And the effect on the economic welfare of native-born Americans is pretty slight. So the last time Congress considered major immigration legislation in a real way, as opposed to the sort of clown show that we had in the spring of 2018, was 2013 and 2014. You had a comprehensive immigration bill that had 68 pro votes in the Senate, good bipartisan vote. And the Congressional Budget Office analyzed it and found that the effect of it, including a major increase in immigration levels, a doubling, if I remember correctly, would be that in 20 years, per capita GDP would be 0.2% higher than it otherwise would be. Perfectly willing to accept that, although of course, one wouldn't want to, I guess, take it to the bank. It just doesn't seem like the kind of consideration that ought to be driving our policy. National Academy of Sciences similarly has found that immigrants who've already come to our country increase the economic welfare of native-born Americans by 0.31%. Again, nice to have, but should not be decisive. Some of the smaller scale economic effects, I think, ought to weigh more heavily. I think that the possible effects on the native-born high school dropout population are not ones I would dismiss. They may be a shrinking share of the population, but they're also a disproportionately wildly disadvantaged share of the population, and we shouldn't be cavalier about risking their economic interests. Beyond that, I think that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as well, the economic welfare of immigrants themselves is something that bears some thought. A lot of the numbers that Shika mentioned tracked a lot of the debate that we've had on immigration in focusing on the effect on native-born people, which is important, right? Because Americans who are already here deserve to have their interests looked at by the government, not to the exclusion of all other interests, but primarily. And to the extent that immigration has just a very, very minor effect on those interests, I think that that's a reason not to weigh the economic considerations that heavily. But if a larger inflow of low-skilled immigration is reducing the wage levels for immigrants themselves, that also is something that ought to affect the way we think about our immigration policy, because we want a successful experience of immigration, and part of that involves immigrants themselves being able to move up the economic ladder. For any particular level of immigration that we have, that we as a country decide makes sense, it seems to me that we are more likely to have a positive economic experience to the extent that we are trying to recruit people on the basis of the skills they bring to our economy, and not, for example, simply trying to hit an ethnic diversity target or national origin target, or to reunify extended families. Part of my thinking about the economic effects of immigration is dependent on the economic circumstances in which we find ourselves. I don't think that those circumstances are the same as those in Lincoln's or even Reagan's day. And I think that the changes are ones that tell against an open borders policy. We have, in various ways, an economy that is less conducive to upward mobility, that is less of a strong back economy and more of a cognitive skill rewarding economy. We are a more regulated society in which, for example, something like a third of all jobs now require some kind of government certificate or license in order to perform. Whether one likes some of these changes in American life or dislikes them or wants them to be changed, they are, I think, features of American life that should make us less enthusiastic about low-skilled immigration than we were in times past. Last, and most important in my view, while the economic considerations are not, I think, uppermost in my mind, what does concern me most is assimilation. And I think it's important because this is something that different people understand in different ways, whether they're for it or against it. And what I mostly have in mind is, again, that shared sense of belonging. I want newcomers to our country to be full participants in American life, in our politics, in our economy, in our culture, to see themselves and be seen by others as fully American, just like native-born Americans. That doesn't mean giving up on every aspect of the culture of the place that an immigrant came from. And to some extent, it means that the overall country changes in response to new ways, new cuisines, new insights, new talents. But in the nature of things, I think the brunt of the work is done by immigrants themselves as they adapt to the new country and come to see it as their own, adopt its ancestors as their own, take its history to be not just the history of the United States of America, but in an important way, their own history, that they are now part of the U.S. national story. And it seems to me that a concern for assimilation is one that suggests that we ought to have limits on the total number of immigrants, that the fewer immigrants we take within reason, the more we will be able to assimilate immigrants. I think that you can see that very easily in the case of the kind of wage questions that I was talking about when we're talking about the economic integration of immigrant populations. But I think there's something analogous that can be said about other aspects of assimilation, that ties to the old country will be a little bit weaker, and ties to the new country a little bit stronger when the former are not being constantly reinforced by a large influx of newcomers from the old country. And I would also say that in thinking about our sort of cohesiveness, our sense of ourselves as being a common country, that the political resistance to immigration is something that we should pay attention to. So, for example, I believe that one of the negative effects of the amount of immigration that we have had and the kind of immigration that we've had over the last 2 generations is paving the way for the election of Donald Trump. I don't believe that he would have become president if we had not had an immigration policy that was heedless of the concerns of a lot of Americans, not always of a majority of Americans, but of a significant percentage of them. When immigration and resistance to immigration becomes a highly salient issue in our politics, it seems to me that we should consider the possibility that that is telling us something about where our absorptive capacity is. So those are the sort of considerations and overall principles or dispositions, maybe is a better word, that I think ought to guide our policy. I would like to just finish off by making a few comments about how I think those policies, how those considerations should cash out in terms of policy. First, on the question of the proper legal status of illegal immigrants, I think that we need to follow a sequential policy, not have a sort of all or nothing policy of legalization, but a policy of legalization in stages. I would start with legalization of those people who came here as illegal immigrants as minors. And I would do so in a broader way than legislation is sometimes contemplated. So, for example, I would not require that people in that population have to either attend college or join the military, an equation, by the way, that strikes me as offensive. I would couple that legalization with increased enforcement measures, and particularly with requiring employers to verify the legal status of new hires. Although other kinds of enforcement increases could also be talked about, I think that's probably the one that's most important, in part because it wouldn't just get at the problem of illegal border crossing, but also at the problem of illegal visa overstaying, which is a very significant proportion of our illegal immigration problem. The idea, I think, of doing this would be that we would address a trust deficit that we have that has made it hard to set immigration policy. There are some people who are just dead set against legalization on principle ever for any population, and there are some people who think that it is required as a matter of justice now. I myself am not in either of those categories, and I think a decisive group of Americans is not in either of those categories either. And that decisive group, I think, is open to the idea of legalization, but wants to make sure that we don't have a legalization that acts as a magnet for further illegal immigration in the expectation that there will be another legalization 10, 20 years from now. At the same time, there are legitimate worries on the part of people who are more on the pro-immigration side of the argument that a lot of conservatives say they want to deal with enforcement and legalization, and they just say they want enforcement first, but you'll get enforcement and then they will never deliver on the other end of the deal. I think you make a show of good faith by having a little bit of what each side of this dispute wants, and then maybe you can go further, hopefully, I think, culminating in the legalization of illegal immigrants who have been here for a long time, who have put down roots here, and who have generally been law-abiding with the exception of specifically immigration-related crimes. And alongside with that, I would also like, as I think should be clear by now, a reorientation of legal immigration towards skills. This can be done in a variety of ways. None of those ways is perfect. I am tentatively inclined to thinking that a loose and not especially prescriptive point system is probably the best thing that we've got. I don't think that should be all of our immigration policy. I certainly think that, for example, spousal reunification actually ought to be a higher priority than our current system makes it, but I would lean more heavily in that direction. And on the question of total numbers of legal immigrants, I would just leave it alone. I wouldn't increase it, I wouldn't decrease it, but if you've been following the overall policy mix I'm talking about, if you keep legal immigration flat while having increased enforcement of illegal immigration, that should mean that the total flow of immigrants, legal plus illegal, moderates. And if you leave the total amount of legal immigration flat while also reducing illegal immigration and shifting legal immigration from lower skilled to higher skilled, that should be a pretty substantial reduction in low-skilled immigration on net. All in all, I think that this is a policy mix that fits the country's needs, that is consistent with public opinion, and that fits with our best traditions. And it is a mix of policies that is amenable to the kind of compromise and bargaining that a successful political settlement on this issue will require. In conclusion, I'll just say I think that we have generally had a pretty happy experience nationally with immigration. I don't wish to end that. I wish to ensure that going forward. And I think that these sorts of changes and this kind of balanced approach to immigration is our best feasible means of doing so.
Thank you. Thank you both for those very thoughtful remarks. Sheikha, I saw you taking a lot of notes. Would you like to respond to some points of?
Sure. Is this on? Can you hear me? So as I suspected, Ramesh is a pretty chill guy. And just to be clear, I wasn't really setting you up. I was just making general remarks about the kind of restrictionist arguments you hear. I knew full well that you and I are not 180 degrees apart on this issue. We are maybe 90 degrees. So there are several points of agreement. But for the sake of this discussion, let me just focus on some of the disagreements. You mentioned that the literature shows that the vast majority of benefits, economic benefits of immigration go to immigrants themselves. And George Borjas and I had actually a huge debate in the issue in the Reason edition, where he and I sort of, in a very old-fashioned way, wrote letters to each other responding. I wrote opening comments to his book, and then he responded to mine, and it was a 4-part exchange. You guys can check that out, in which we actually discussed this. And this is one of Borjas's big points, is precisely that of all the benefits, GDP stimulation that the immigrants do, only about 50 billion is surplus, and that surplus value, in fact, he said, only goes to employers. So it's really, nobody is benefited except for immigrants and employers. The problem with that line of argument is that you could say that about any employment. I mean, like, if, the vast majority of natives who work for employers would have the exact same equation, and yet we wouldn't say, well, let's, reduce our employment force, let's reduce the number of workers in this economy, so that we can increase the wages of those who are already here. So it's not a very persuasive line of argument. You mentioned, this is actually something that Rehan really, develops in his book, that he accepts that actually low-skilled immigrants don't really hurt the wages of other native low-skilled immigrants. They only hurt the wages of other immigrants because they're directly competing with them. They're just like them. Native low-skilled workers are not affected that much by immigrants because they have other skills. They have cultural skills. They have linguistic skills. They know America. And those start commanding a premium. I mean, this is a very well-developed point in economic literature, that the more immigrants you bring in, low-skilled immigrants you bring in, you produce a certain diversity of skill sets, and the acculturation skills of Americans, they command a higher premium on the market and are worth more. So the main effect is actually in lowering the wages of other low-skilled immigrants. But if you, again, if you ask these low-skilled immigrants, well, do you want to stop immigration? Do you want to earn higher wages so that, but leave your parents and your mothers and your, families behind in your countries, and you will find that they don't want that. So, I mean, if we are going to think about their benefit, then perhaps we should listen to them a little bit. Ramesh mentioned assimilation and ethnic replenishment. This is, again, something that Rehan mentions in his book, that the immigrants already here would lose their ties with their, with the old world, with their countries of origin, if they weren't constantly being replenished. I mean, I would take that argument seriously if there was any reason to believe on any metric that immigrants were not assimilating. But if you look at all of the objective metrics, English speaking, rates of intermarriage, participation in the military, Hispanics surprisingly have a greater participation in the military than any other groups. So it doesn't seem like there is any big problem. I would take this argument seriously if there was any reason to believe that the immigrants here were getting disaffected. It doesn't seem to be the case. The ranks of Antifa are not actually filled with immigrants or even their firstborn. It is largely Native Americans. If Pew Research has done a number of polls, and the confidence and satisfaction with American institutions is way higher among immigrants than it is among the native-born. Muslim Americans who are considered to be disaffected, they have something like a 56% confidence level in our institutions, whereas native-born have something like 23. So if you want to increase America's confidence in its institutions, I think immigration would be the recipe here. Political resistance, something that you mentioned. This sounds good that there's a lot of political resistance to immigration, and we ought to worry about that. Hillary Clinton said the populist wave in Europe would not have happened if we had curbed immigration. So Trump and Hillary agree on something, I suppose. But again, there is no law of nature that says that there is some upper limit beyond which natives are going to react. I mean, Canada has a foreign-born population of 20% compared to ours, foreign 14%. Australia has 28%, and Canada just today actually re-elected Justin Trudeau, who's a big friend of immigrants. Not just that, dealt a resounding defeat to the People Party candidate, I forget his name, Maxime Bernier or something. He lost it even in his own province, in his own, in his own district. So there is a great deal to be said about our political conversation and how much it affects the ability of immigrants to feel comfortable and what the general public will accept in terms of the numbers. Enforcement, that's the last thing you mentioned. Enforcement measures. You say that, and I understand you're actually, I've read some of your work and it's very reasonable. You're for amnesty, which is great, which is not a position that all National Review writers take, so I appreciate that, believe me. On the other hand, this idea that we should make enforcement and legalization go hand in hand, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. National Review doesn't buy that when it comes to drug legalization, for instance. And the immigration policies that we have, the extremely restrictive policies that we have, are kind of labor prohibitionism, just as you had drug prohibitionism, which created crime by creating a black market in something that people wanted. So you really cannot deal with the enforcement issues without first legalization and only legalization. Once you have decent policies in place that make it easier for people who want to come over here, do no harm to us, all they want to do is work, you make it easier for them to get work permits, you lower the number of people who are trying to come across the border and do us harm precipitously, and then you can devote enforcement resources to those. Immigration crimes have started consuming more federal dollars than any other federal crime combined. We spend more on immigration enforcement now than we spend on drug enforcement, other federal DEA, PT, none of them consume as much as immigration. So we've tried this enforcement approach and it doesn't seem to work. It just keeps taking us down towards more and greater draconian and harsh interior policies as well as enforcement policies at the border. I'll stop there.
Anything to add?
happens, yes. Let's start with the economic points, where I think we end up having agreement on some of the empirical matters and a different assessment of what to make of those matters. It is right, as Shika says, that if you perform this kind of calculation I was talking about, in terms of sort of who gets the added amount of GDP from anybody's labor, it's going to be those people. That's exactly true. And she is further right that that we wouldn't, on that basis, want to, let's say, throw everybody over age 50 out of the labor force. But of course, that's not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that the added increment to GDP is not a compelling reason to bring immigrants in. It's not a reason to increase immigration levels. It's not even a reason to keep immigration levels as they are. It is the economic considerations in terms of the effects on native-born Americans are just not that large to begin with. Now, it is certainly the case, as Shika was suggesting, I don't make all the arguments that one associates with restrictionism, and she doesn't make all the arguments that you could associate with the open border side. But it is certainly the case that an overwhelming share of the pro-more immigration argument is based on we need it for economic reasons, we need it for GDP, and that case, I think, just does not hold up because of the underlying factual point on which we both agree. And I think the fact is, it suggests that what's underlying your own advocacy of more immigration isn't actually this economic gain to other people. It's a moral point about people's right to move and about the illegitimacy of governmental coercion and so forth, some of which I think, to a degree, I agree with. I just think that there are other considerations as well. And national sovereignty, the national cohesion, wages at the low end of the labor market, wages for low-skilled immigrants themselves, those things I think ought to affect our policies as well. Now, on the question of the effects of higher or lower immigration on immigrants themselves and on low-skilled immigrants in particular, Shika suggests, well, let's listen to those people. And they don't want reduced immigration. They want the ability to bring their own brothers and sisters and parents to the United States. Well, there actually isn't a ton of polling on this question, and some of the polling suggests that if you don't frame it in those precise terms, you want your own relatives to be able to come here, but should there be limits, should there be tighter limits and so forth, there is more of a conservative or restrictionist bent among recent immigrants than you might expect. And I would also note that let's listen to the people involved view is not, generally speaking, an argument that libertarians and free market people believe, right? I mean, we don't believe that a poll of low-income workers ought to settle the question of raising the minimum wage. It's just, it's not the way we normally think about these questions. I think it makes sense that it's not the way that we think about these questions. On the question of a country's tolerance for immigration, Canada, I think, is an example of how you can have a pretty high immigration policy that doesn't seem to be having politically roiling effects, although whether Trudeau's re-election is a positive or a negative is, I suppose, a matter of opinion. He's certainly welcoming to other culture styles of dress, it turns out. But it seems to me that the tolerance for immigration in Canada is not unrelated to the perception and the reality that they have a policy that is a little bit more geared toward their economic needs and that is more diverse and deliberate than America's policies are. Last point I'll make, so the enforcement question, the idea that you're never going to have good enforcement as long as you've got an incentive for a black market and there are people who want to work and people who want to hire them. which is to say, basically, there shouldn't be limits on immigration, that we should just have the market clearing wage rate. And it just seems to me that, we're referring to the Clemens research that, you'd have this huge increase in global economic welfare if every poor person in the world were allowed to move to a rich country. This seems patently unrealistic. Other countries are not going to do this. It would be constantly an argument against any level of immigration control. It seems to me that it is more fruitful to think in terms of the actually existing range of immigration policies that countries have adopted. There are going to be limits. Given the limits that America seems willing to put up with, we ought to have a more deliberate and better immigration policy than we currently have. We ought to have, and I sort of view it the way I view tax policy. I might not like the level of taxation that we have, but I would like to see, for any particular level of taxation, a tax code that looks like somebody designed it on purpose. And I would like something similar to be able to be said of our immigration policy as well.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions now. This is what we're going to do. We're going to put this microphone in the center there. And we'll ask people, you can start lining up now. It's our tradition to allow students to ask the first questions. While people are going up there, I'm going to just ask one question.
She used that microphone.
Okay. And so my question is one on immigration and partisan politics. So today, the Democrats are the party of pro-immigration and Republicans anti. It's my understanding it wasn't always that way. So let's say going back to World War II, can we get a little history and what caused the changes? You want to start, Ramesh?
No.
Yeah.
Immigration, the political valence of immigration has shifted over time, and it has shifted even in our very recent history. So it wasn't really until the New Deal that immigration became that the immigrant communities became powerfully associated with the Democratic Party. And it really wasn't until the last 20, even 10 years that immigration became as much of a partisan divide as it has been. This seems to be primarily a result, though not entirely, of changing Democratic attitudes on the subject. So as recently as the mid-1990s, the Clinton administration appointed the Jordan Commission that ended up recommending a 1/3 reduction in legal immigration levels. By 2007, the Democratic line was very different from that, but Hillary Clinton was still saying we needed to have tough policies on illegal immigration and not have driver's licenses for illegal immigrants. And of course, the last time she ran, she apologized for using the term illegal immigration. And she talked about, most Democrats were sort of talking about deportation as a dirty word. Clinton was talking about bringing back some people that we had already deported. And since then, some Democrats have talked about abolishing the major immigration enforcement agency. So there's been a lot of movement. I think that, but as with so many issues where we've seen polarization, it's fed on itself. So restrictionism, the idea that illegal immigration is a problem, that we might need less immigration, these things have become more and more associated with being a conservative, with being a Republican, being a supporter of Donald Trump, with being things the Democrats don't want to be, and vice versa, and that I think helps to account for some of the change we've seen.
Yeah, I don't have all that much more to add. I think Ramesh summarized it pretty well. Just one thing, which is that, historically, both parties had some element of pro-immigration sentiment and some element of anti-immigration sentiment. The pro-immigration sentiment among Republicans came from just their belief in free trade, free market, free enterprise, competition, let the best person win. And the anti-immigration sentiment among Democrats used to come from labor unions labor has made its peace with immigration. In fact, for labor unions, as far as they were, labor unions in some ways are the culprit, in my view, in the whole undocumented issue we are facing. We used to have a program with Mexico called the Parcero program until 1965, which once we got rid of that, and didn't replace it with other workable guest worker programs, what used to be a cyclical population of Mexican workers who came over here, worked, when the economy was good, when they were needed, and returned later on, that stopped. Essentially, because it became so much more risky to cross the border, once they came here, they stayed. So in a sense, we've created the undocumented problem because of labor unions who were opposed to the Parcero program. What was a cyclical population has become now a permanent undocumented population over here. Labor since then has had, thanks to right of work laws around the country, has become much weaker. They are losing members, and now they see immigrants in some senses as a way of raising their numbers. And so they have done something of a flip. Republicans are the more interesting party to understand. It's unclear why they have suddenly become this restrictionist and have basically assumed the nativist mantle. I mean, Republicans were sort of divided. They, at least till 1995, Spencer Abraham, who was who was a part of the first Bush administration and then was part of the Clinton administration, he was a huge advocate for looser immigration policies. He was a Republican senator from Michigan, and that wing of the Republican Party, for some reason, has been completely lost. And now you see that the two parties the Democrats are in this, what I say, a virtuous cycle. Because they are pro-immigration, more immigrants go towards them and they become more pro-immigration. Their whole electoral strategy has become, trying to cobble together the non-white voters, which makes them pro-immigration. Republicans are going in the opposite direction. They are in a vicious cycle on immigration. The more they dump on immigrants, the more immigrants abandon them, and the more they have to then double down and try and go for the white working class vote. In my prediction is that in the future, especially with Trump at the helm, you're going to see the two parties flip on labor, that Democrats are going to be less pro-labor and Republicans are going to become more pro-labor because, that's how they are headed.
Thank you. So we have 20 minutes for questions. We'll ask people to ask a question and not speechify.
Okay.
And please identify yourself.
My name is Samya. I'm a sophomore here. I study public health. And first of all, I want to thank you both so much for coming today and speaking. It was so interesting. I have, sort of as a public health student, I've been reading a lot about this controversy. California recently passed a bill that is allowing illegal immigrants to to enroll under Medicaid and make use of the healthcare system. And a lot of people are saying that's not right. Illegal immigrants shouldn't be allowed to cash in on the Medicaid system. So I was wondering for both of you, kind of, how do you see this need, like even if a person is undocumented, do they have a right to healthcare, especially since many of them are working, in agriculture where it could be dangerous?
On this, actually, maybe Ramesh and I maybe will begin with some agreement, which is I don't think healthcare as such is a right. I mean, it's a good that has to be purchased. Somebody has to produce it. That person deserves to be compensated for the service that they are producing. And so, and if that's the case, then you need something like payment and markets and price signals for the healthcare industry. That said, healthcare for illegal immigrants, here's the problem. I mean, I'm actually not that opposed to what California is doing, as I maybe should be. And the reason is that in this country, it is almost impossible because of the way our healthcare system is set up. It is almost impossible to buy healthcare in the individual market. All the tax advantages go to employers. So if you have an employer who's willing to pay for your healthcare, then that's how you get your healthcare. If you have to go to the individual market, it's virtually impossible. On top of that, Obamacare actually made it illegal for immigrants, undocumented immigrants to go to Obamacare exchanges. So what I'm in favor of is opening those exchanges to whoever wants to buy healthcare so that they can buy it on the individual market. And I think that system ought to be opened to undocumented workers too. That barrier to them availing, accessing healthcare ought to be available to them.
So I think it's one of the many extremely difficult and tricky issues that arise when you have the kind of half serious or quarter serious immigration policy that we've had for so long, where you have an illegal immigrant population that is this large. Once you've got it, you have a difficult situation. Since 1986, federal law has said that illegal immigrants, like everybody, are entitled to medical care in emergency rooms. Whether this is the most sensible way to guarantee health care for everybody is a reasonable question. At the same time, you don't want to have a large population that is outside the medical system that could be spreading infection. You don't want it on humanitarian grounds. You don't want it on public health grounds. So I think that there's a reasonable case for just saying whatever your policy is, include illegal immigrants in them. I do think that for a lot of people it is going to be like a slap in the face to be told you're going to have to pay higher taxes, and part of this higher taxes is going to go to the medical care of people who legally are not supposed to be here. It is the sort of thing that maybe you could sustain if you were also simultaneously signaling that you had some sort of plan, whether it's hers or mine, to make this problem shrink over time.
Thank you both so much.
Hi, my name is Nicole. I'm actually an immigrant myself. Came to the United States 25 years ago from Venezuela. And my question is for Ramesh. In regards to assimilating, you did mention that was, I guess, the overall goal. But how do you literally provide examples of assimilation for immigrants in today's society where there's a rise in hate crimes and racism and just an overall disdain for illegal immigration?
So there have been, certainly at the height of our politics, more expressions of racism and more, let's say, racism adjacent expression is not something I would argue with, and I think it is a problem. I think it is a problem for the same reasons that I think assimilation is important, because it undermines our shared sense of belonging, that we're all Americans, and that we're in it together, common interests, common aspirations, and are common members of a polity. So I wouldn't say, I think, those people who are engaged in that sort of thing should knock it off. And those people who are not engaged in it should condemn it when they hear it and see it in other people. And I think that the Republican Party in particular has been derelict in that duty. But at the same time, I also believe that the assimilation of immigrants is something that requires something from everybody, but just in the nature of things requires more from immigrants themselves than from others.
Let me just add one quick comment to it. I think that was a very good question. I mean, one of the paradoxes of our current moment is that at the same time that we are asking immigrants to assimilate, we are also creating a very hostile environment towards immigrants and, with our political conversation, which automatically causes them to retreat into their own enclaves because they see mainstream America as hostile to them. And so, this is a difficult issue. I mean, and I think if we want immigrants to assimilate more than they already are, and I think they are all assimilating, there isn't really any difference between how current waves are doing compared to previous waves. then perhaps we need to chill a little, like Croatia.
Theme of our evening.
Hi there. My name's Avery. I'm a senior here studying political theory and economics. I really appreciate the conversation. It was quite informative. My main question, I guess, is to Dalmia, specifically because you said you're only 90 degrees away from Paneru on this. Trying to figure out how to, shrink that degree a bit. And ask you, I'm curious why your policy wouldn't be simply a way higher rate for high-skill immigration. And the reason I bring this up is just because a couple of things. The literature by Haymuller and Hopkins, they put out a paper in 2013 called The Hidden American Immigration Consensus. Found that most Americans, this is before Trump showed up, and as we all know, these leaders polarize people in parties. Before Trump showed up, pretty much people in the Democratic and Republican Party in surveys identified as mostly favoring high-skill and preferably English-fluent immigrants. There was general consensus in that literature. But that's one study. Another thing I would point to is you correctly pointed out the high foreign-born, even higher than the US, in Canada and Australia. Both countries, however, which employ very stringent restrictions on low-skill immigration. Australia is notorious for this, but Canada as well has the benefit having a giant economy right underneath it, basically to lower its problem. Also, it's surrounded by oceans. And so Canada is actually some of the longest visa wait times precisely because they're worried about that. And they understand, as I believe Trudeau at one point said, illegal immigration would be intolerable. And to finalize this up, the most prominent examples of low-skill immigration I can think of in Europe have brought actually far more populist right-wing reactions than the US. Americans are pretty happy with immigration relative. European, Central Europe, actually not so much with low-skill immigrants. And finally, I would say if there was a legal mechanism for this, like a guest worker program, the closest examples I can think of would be things like Qatar or Singapore, where you have a very exploitative relationship, basically, where I agree people might benefit by coming to work $5 an hour to be a servant for a college-educated person, but the relations in that scenario do not strike me as the kind of thing that Americans want to see. They want to see a broad middle class of co-equals, and having a lot of really low-wage servants seems contrary to that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. Thank you.
Those are all excellent points. Look, I mean, I don't have any bias towards one or other form of immigrant class, high-skilled or low-skilled. My point is that it's not up to me or central planners to dictate these numbers. We need to take our cues from the market, what the industry wants, what businesses want. In Canada, actually, what has happened is that they are moving away from their point system, which was heavily weighted towards certain kinds of high skills. What that created was a certain kind of credentialist fetish in Canada. They were getting PhD physicists who could not find ultimately jobs and were driving cabs. I mean, I actually personally took a Russian physics PhD who drove me from the airport to the city, and so there was a huge mismatch in who was being admitted and what the economy wanted. That's one thing actually the American system has done rather well, is that it doesn't bring in people who can't really who can't get a job, even in family-based immigration. The Ramesh was talking about how we need to limit family-based immigration. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of family-based immigration in this country are, spouses and minor children. When you have siblings coming in, they tend to only come even when they have the option, when they know they can get jobs over here. So even our family-based system is fairly in sync with what the economy needs. Canada, what it has done is precisely to address this problem of this, credential mismatch. They have created the provincial nominee program, where they give a quota to every province to basically get whoever they want, of whatever skill level they want. I actually wrote a piece on the provincial nominee program, and I was talking to a lawyer over there, and I kept telling him, well, how many high-skilled immigrants do provinces allow? And he kept talking about welders and plumbers, and I'm going, but those are not high-skilled. But in Canada, they actually count as high-skilled immigrants in the provinces. And the provincial nominee program has been extremely successful. It does such a granular matching of the jobs or the qualifications of the immigrants and the jobs that are needed, even though these immigrants get their permanent residency the minute they arrive and they can move wherever they want to, retention rate for each province is over 80%. So I am all right with not getting low-skilled immigrants if American employers don't want them. That's not what we are hearing. And let me tell you one other dirty secret about this administration. Even as it has gutted the H-1B program in red tape, I mean, there is, Stephen Miller knows the administrative rules extremely well. It has gutted the H-1B program. At the same time, it has increased the quota for H-2A and H-2B programs because that's where the red states are. Red states tend to be, agricultural, not coastal. And so he gets an earful, Trump gets an earful every time he tries to cut that quota. So in fact, this administration is doing the exact opposite of what, Ramesh would want. So, I'm all right. I mean, let the economy decide, let the market decide what the mix of low-skilled and high-skilled ought to be.
I just want to add to that point that at any given time, the administration is simultaneously taking one of our positions and the others.
He doesn't take any of my positions.
So, you may remember in the last State of the Union address, Trump ad-libbed that he wanted to have the greatest legal immigration levels ever, which is maybe a little closer to what you would want than what I do. I think this may tell us something about the nature of this administration.
So I see 4 people in line. We'll take those questions, but maybe we could take 2 at a time and try and wrap up in 10 minutes.
Hi, I'm Farida. I'm a freshman majoring in political science. Thank you both for being here. My question's for Dalmia. So one of the solutions you suggested is to change the federal regulation of immigration to rather give this power of enforcement to the states. But my question is how this would actually better this solution, because historically we've seen that states have been the violator of our very fundamental rights. That's why we had the incorporation through the 14th Amendment. Today we see voter ID laws. And also there's this principle that rights transcend borders. So how would your plan account for disparities between immigration policies that would be implemented in states like California versus Texas? How would it be better if states had the power instead?
So,
One more question. Let's
Just really quick, sorry. Hi again, it's Samia. So earlier this year, the Department of Labor kind of officially said that the U.S. is in a labor shortage. We have an aging population. Do you think that there's a way in which policymakers can use kind of the statistics, the kind of market approach to, hey, these are the workers that we actually need, to communicate that better to the public and kind of reduce this fear that immigrants are bringing violence and crime and drugs? And is there a substantive way that can be better communicated to the public and kind of combat that
Thank you.
sentiment?
So states and communicating to the public.
So states' rights. What's interesting again in our current political moment, it used to be that conservatives and Republicans were the states' rights party, right? Now actually it's Democrats who are the states' right party in some ways. Look at California and the issue of environmental regulations on cars. California wants the authority to impose its own high, standards on emissions. And Republicans are opposing this. So I don't think there is, so that notion that comes to us, from the time of the 14th Amendment, that states are just sort of not going to honor individual rights. I mean, that's sort of flipped. So I'm not sure that's all that germane anymore. As to how we are going to manage, what you were talking about, that anybody who comes to this country can move anywhere. So if states are given the authorities to issue their own visas, how do we manage that mobility? And actually, Cato Institute, Alex Noraste has put together a really good plan where essentially what you do is you give every state a certain quota to get immigrants that they want. If they are unable to retain those immigrants, they lose their quota incrementally every year. In addition, you can have a little bond on immigrants, and if they stay in the state, they get their bond back. If they don't, they lose the bond. So there are various mechanisms for for doing that kind of thing. But just let me remind you that, if Canada's example is any indication, states do a very, very good job of matching immigrants to the needs of the economy. So immigrants are likely to stay there, especially if the political climate of that state is hospitable. They
Want to
don't
do on the
really have to.
communication question?
And then the aging population. That's actually a very good question. And my contention, which I organized a whole conference on this, was that, in some ways, Ramesh and I are fighting the last immigration battle over here, in the sense that the future problem of the West and America is not going to be too much immigration, but too little immigration, because Western countries are aging, and the rest of the world has completed what's called a demographic transition, which is that their infant mortality rates are now not that high, whereas their fertility rates are. That used to be the time when you would get a surplus population and they were sending us people. That transition state is over now. And within the next 30, 40 years, we are going to see a precipitous drop of the number of people coming here. At that point, instead of throwing immigrants out, we are going to have to go back to something like Lincoln time, which is, we are going to have to come up with Immigration Encouragement Act. And I'll be opposing it because I'm opposed to government intervention.
I'll just say on the communications thing, I think better policies are the best communication strategy, that people will be less concerned about immigration if they have a sense that the laws are going to be enforced going forward, if they have a sense that we have a rational system that, again, somebody has sort of designed on purpose, and that once you've got those things in place, it is less important that you have the right press releases.
Now, I'm old enough to remember when National Review was against central planning.
She wants 50 states with their own bureaucracies matching it out. It sounds like a lot of decentralized planning to me.
Our final two questions, short questions and then short answers.
I'll try to make it as short as possible. Basically, my question, my name is Brady, by the way, and my question is, when it comes to immigration, while economic arguments are often important, for most people, I think at a fundamental level, they often think of identity as one of the most important aspects of immigration, in the sense that when people think of their nation, they often want to think of something that they can relate to and that they connect to. And you've kind of seen, a radicalization of the Republican Party in recent years that many people that they felt were underlying aspects of the United States are being lost as the country gets more diverse, which makes people scared of what their country will look like in the future. And that are more on a deeper level than kind of vague civic ideas of what a country should be. And you're kind of seeing two fundamental different ideas of what the United States should be from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and how in the future can you create a cohesive country with such different ideas of what a country is. Thank you.
Last question.
Hi, Jonathan. I'd like to talk a little bit about, or ask a little about exceptions, general exceptions. So in World War II, Filipino citizens could enlist in the U.S. Armed Services and were promised immigration benefits. A more recent example would be the trouble with Iraqi interpreters. My general sense is, with these people who are willing to fight and risk their lives for a flag they can't die under, and the government that promised them certain things wasn't giving it to them, then really, although the intensity of the anti-immigrant sentiment may be new now, is the general sense of it kind of deeply embedded enough to reject even these sort of very exceptional, very small population?
So on diversity and cohesiveness, I actually think if you want cohesiveness, you should have more diversity. Imagine in this country after the Civil War, if you had only two racial groups, whites and blacks, right, and with nothing in between. Would you get more polarization, or would you get less polarization? This country was founded actually on diversity. I mean, the whole James Madison argument of factions, increasing the factions, was an argument for pluralism and diversity. I mean, I actually, Lord Acton, I have this very good quote from him in which he says, "Liberty provokes diversity and diversity preserves liberty. This diversity in the name of state is a firm barrier against the intrusion of the government beyond the political sphere." And essentially what they were saying was, if you have a very diverse population, I mean, now you got to remember that in the founding, the main problem that they were trying to address was tyranny of the majority. They did not want large factions because those were always bad from the standpoint of empowering a tyrant. And their solution was to have a very diverse population and break up the power structure at the electoral level. And the more diversity you have, the more you keep that scheme alive, in a sense. And so I don't see diversity as diminishing cohesiveness. I actually see it as increasing cohesiveness. I think the black and white civil divide would have been far greater if there hadn't been all these immigrants who had been coming to America and showing that there is a promise of opportunity here, and this isn't really that racist and class-driven society. People can find their way here. That's been, I think, a hugely cohesive force.
Try to keep it quick. I actually agree, diversity among immigrants can serve the overall cause of social cohesion. To my mind, that's another argument for shifting our immigration policies toward skills as opposed to the reunification of extended families, where it's based on sort of the people who happen to have been in recent immigrant groups, as opposed to everybody from all over the world who has the skills. On the pace of change question, I mean, I am a Burkean conservative. I'm not against change, but I do think that change is best handled if it's sometimes a break is put on it. I wouldn't want an end to immigration, but 1 million immigrants a year seems like a very nice way to be welcoming to the world. I wouldn't increase that number, and I would change the way that we handle who we select to be in that million.
The question of the Filipino veteran. Look, I mean, right now we are in a very difficult political moment. I mean, I think if Donald Trump goes away and if somebody semi-sane replaces him, I think our immigration conversation changes the next day. So I don't think Trump is necessarily articulating what the considered view of the American public is, to be this, stingy about who they are handing green cards to, that veterans are being deported today. I don't believe is the American position. So I think this is not intractable, this is not insurmountable. The conversation will change very quickly when you have somebody else who has a handle on the bully pulpit.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to our co-host, the Institute for Humane Studies, to our sponsor, the Diana Davis Spencer Foundation, and please join me again in thanking our